Good evening and welcome to this edition of Africa in Focus. It's a special. We're looking at South Africa, 30 years after Nelson Mandela became the first elected or democratically elected of South Africa. Is South Africa free or is South Africa still under apartheid? That's the theme for today. 30 years on from Nelson Mandela. Is South Africa free or apartheid state? So before we get into the podcast, just to make you aware that if you like what you hear, please share, please like, please share with your friends, your family, social media networks, and you can also sign up, subscribe to the Ghana Africa in Focus podcast. We're on YouTube, and we're also on all the main platform providers, including Spotify. So we want to get 1,000 subscribers on Facebook and Spotify this year. So if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe to Ghana Africa in Focus podcast on YouTube and also on Spotify. And if you're wanting to come to Ghana to do business, buy property, buy land, you want to know about the Ghana card that you need, you want to know about, citizenship, then we offer a consulting service whereby we can help tailor make your needs and wants. And we charge $30 an hour or $20 for a half-hour briefing session. So if you want to book your session with myself, you can email me and I'll leave you my email address in the link to the show. All right, so let's get into this week's podcast. It's an Africa in Focus special, looking about South Africa, 30 years after Mandela became the first democratically elected president of South Africa. And we're asking the question, is South Africa free or is South Africa still an apartheid state? So, many of you would remember, or some of you remember, that Nelson Mandela was released from prison in February 1990, and he became the first democratically elected president of South Africa in 1994. And since then, his party, the African National Congress, ANC, has won all the elections since then, and are, currently in power right now. And the next elections in South Africa will be taking place next month in May, but April 27th is a very, very significant date in South Africa because it represents Freedom Day, and also 30 years to the day when Nelson Mandela was elected as South Africa's first democratically elected president. And so today we're posing the question, is South Africa free or is South Africa still under apartheid? For me, South Africa is not a free country. South Africa is still under apartheid, but a different form of apartheid. And as the podcast goes on, I will explain to you why South Africa is still under apartheid. Yeah. So, as you should know, or if you don't know, white people imposed a system of color codedness that they called apartheid. So when the first Europeans came to South Africa in 1664, so-called Cape of Good Hope, so-called Cape Town, that's where the first Europeans, invaders, that's where they so-called settled, yeah? But the controversial thought, in 1948, that is when they the Europeans instituted a formal system of segregation, just like in America in the 60s. Well, not in the 60s, but America was after the American Civil War, 1865, that's what they call Jim Crow. That's when America had a formalized system of segregation. Now in South Africa, that system of segregation was called apartheid, and that was a formally instituted policy and system that the Europeans called apartheid. And apartheid is a Dutch word meaning separate on the basis of color. And so the Dutch, in cohort with the British, but the Dutch were in power then, the National Party, that's what the party of the you could say the Dutch political elite. And they were the ones who, under a man called Hendrik Verwoerd, they instituted the legal parameters of what became known as apartheid. Yeah. And so under apartheid, every people were divided according to their so-called race. So Africans had their own sector, Europeans had their own sector, Indians had their own sector, and so have you. Yeah. And also, by this time, Africans had their land stolen, looted, thieved from them by Europeans. And one way in which this happened, and again, I'll leave you proof of this in the footnotes, is the I think it's 1912 or 1914 so-called Native Act, whereby European people, white people, that gave that so-called law, gave them the right. Now, what gave them the right to think that? But anyway, that law of 1914 gave Europeans, white people, the right to steal land from African people. So the best land, yeah, that Africans sat on was taken from Africans and given to Europeans in the guise of the Dutch and the British. Yeah. And the Dutch and the British fought wars amongst themselves. The famous one is the Anglo-Boer War. Yeah. To actually, see who could hold, the majority of the land in South Africa. And so, as a result of this war, the Anglo-Boer War of the late 1800s, I think it was late 1890 something, but again, I'll put the footnotes in the podcast notes. This war enabled both the British and the Dutch to have large parts of African land. So the Dutch had predominantly, what is called, Transvaal. So where Pretoria is, where Johannesburg is, all that area, yeah, which was taken by the Dutch, basically the middle belt of what we call today South Africa. And then the British, they had two chunks of land, where Cape Town is today called the Western Cape, and also where, parts of, Durban is, KwaZulu-Natal. They took a bit about that. But Africans, in the guise of the Zulus, and let's not forget the great King Shaka Zulu, fought the British on the two Zulu wars for the Zulus to have autonomy over their own land, in the main of their own land. So KwaZulu-Natal, most of that land belonged to Africans, yeah? But the vast majority of the land that was seized by Europeans, or that's stolen by Europeans, was in the hands of the Dutch and the British. And so, because of this war that the British had with the Dutch and their descendants, who they call Boers, I will never call them Afrikaners because they are not African. Yeah, those Europeans, those Caucasians in South Africa are not African. Just as the African people, black people living in Europe are not Europeans. Yeah, those European people in South Africa are not Europeans. They are descendants of either British or Dutch Huguenots, yeah, or French peasants and German settlers. Yeah, that's the people who call themselves Afrikaners, but they're actually Boers. That's where their origins are. They are European by origin, and you could say their tribal grouping is either Huguenot or French peasant or German background. Yeah. And so they were the ones who, the Boers, they, took political power in that country that was called the Republic of South Africa. Yeah. They took power and they were the ones who instituted a formal state of segregation like America, but they called it apartheid. So apartheid in legal form existed from 1948 to about 1994. And I'll come on to that in a minute. So during this time, African people could not own land. And even today, yeah, in South Africa, so-called South Africa, that true African name is Azania, yeah? But for the purpose of this podcast, we'll call it South Africa. So under apartheid, African people in South Africa could not own land. Under this system of apartheid, subjugation, African people could not vote. Under a system of apartheid, African people could not use the same hotel, restaurant, buses, even burial service had to be used at different separate graves. So African people could not use the same grave, could not eat at the same restaurant, could not dine in the same hotel, could not sleep in the same accommodation as European people. Yeah. So under apartheid, African people were basically stripped of their humanity, yeah, and treated as fourth-class citizens in their own country. That's what apartheid, actually did to African people, relegated them to subhuman status, as if you're a dog, as if you're an animal. Even an animal was treated better than African people during the apartheid era. Yeah. Such was the wickedness that was imposed by the British, by the Dutch, yeah, in South Africa in the apartheid era. And let's not forget, the formal system of apartheid was supported by the West. So the UK, the US, the European Union, Germany, Australia, all these countries supported the apartheid regime of Hendrik Verwoerd and later later John Foster, then P.W. Botha, and then the last apartheid president was F W De Klerk. But we'll come on to that later. So that was how the system of apartheid subjugated African people and relegated African people to subhuman status. Yeah? So this is why you had groups like the African National Congress, the South African Communist Party, and other Pan-African groups rise up to say that we as African people are not going to put up with this system of apartheid. And so, there was an uprising, and one of the most famous uprisings was the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, where African people rose up to this brutal system of apartheid, which was very, very similar to Jim Crow in America after the Civil War and until 1964, when the Civil Rights Act was signed. And so that was the beginning, 1960, the Sharpeville massacre, that was the beginning of the anti-apartheid struggle. Yeah. And this massacre at Sharpeville, where European armed soldiers shot, willy-nilly, openly shot, harmless, defenseless African people. And this was the first time that the whole world outside of South Africa saw this, brutalization of African people. To the extent that even, other parts of so that time, 1960, there were about 32 African countries that had gained political rule. And those African countries made it a duty to shun South Africa because of the apartheid nature of that country. Now, another uprising, which was very, very instrumental, was the Soweto uprising in 1976. This followed the death of Steve Biko. Again, I put Steve Biko in the notes to the show. Steve Biko was a radical Pan-Africanist, right? And the film was made about him that starred Denzel Washington. Yeah, I think the film was called Cry Freedom. Yeah. And Steve Biko was a very, very, articulate, young African man who spoke out against the vicious and the wickedness of the apartheid regime. And actually, he was murdered by the white police force in a cell in 1976, which then precipitated onto the Soweto uprisings of the same year. So that Soweto uprising as well, that gained worldwide attention. And that also led to, a lot of countries begin to boycott, not just in Africa, but other countries around the world, countries in Latin America, countries in, Asia, began to boycott South Africa because of this wicked system of apartheid that subjugated the African. And so this is where, so after Steve Biko, this is where the ANC came. But before that, Nelson Mandela, he rose up in the early 60s and he was jailed for his he led a kind of Martin Luther King non-violent resistance with the police. And he was jailed for that activity in 1963. And he was jailed for 27 years because the apartheid state said that he committed treason. And as such treason, he would have to serve a lot of his time in prison. And so Nelson Mandela in 1964 was locked up along with other high-ranking members of the African National Congress, ANC, locked up. First of all, there was a prison that was locked up before, he was sent to Robben Island, just off Cape Town. But fast forward to the 70s, and that's where the other radical African groups like the Pan-African Congress and also the South African Communist Party, they took, along with Winnie Mandela, the great woman, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, the wife of Nelson Mandela at the time, they took up the mantle to fight for freedom of African people. And to backtrack a little, how many of you are aware that the whole struggle of South Africa, of Africans in South Africa, there was something that they called the Freedom Charter? It's a very, very big document, but in a nutshell, 3 key factors were eminent in the Freedom Charter that was the whole mantle of the apartheid struggle that Nelson Mandela and others led. And I'll come on to Mandela in a minute. So the key features of the Freedom Charter were: 1, to give African people their land back, land which had been brutally stolen by Europeans, by Caucasian people. Yeah, that was 1, to give back African land back to its original indigenous owners. 2, the redistribution of wealth, yeah, to the African people. And 3, the control of South Africa's resources, particularly mineral resources, to the people. Yeah, and I'll get back onto the mineral resources also later on in the podcast. But those, in a nutshell, were the 3 key pillars of the Freedom Charter. Now let's back a bit to Nelson Mandela. Now, many of you who are listening to this podcast and don't know the history of South Africa think that Nelson Mandela was the catalyst for changing South Africa. No. In actual fact, Nelson Mandela was not an original member or founder of the ANC. The original fathers and founders of the ANC were Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, and Govan Mbeki. Again, I'll put their names in the notes to this podcast so that you understand who were the true founding fathers of the ANC. Not Nelson Mandela, but Govan Mbeki, whose son, Thabo Mbeki, became the second president of South Africa after Nelson Mandela. Then Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu. Those 3 men were the architects of the ANC. but they whipped in Mandela because Mandela was a legal practitioner and was also, like Kwame Nkrumah and like Martin Luther King, a very, very charismatic person. So this is why Mandela later on became the face of the African National Congress, ANC, but he was not the founder of the ANC. So we need to make that clear. So, like I said, so when Mandela was locked up, Mandela and and the other leaders of the ANC, and also while Mandela was locked up, other members of the ANC were also in exile, yeah, to other African countries and also in Europe, yeah. And also, for you South Africans, you so-called black South Africans, who are now wanting to beat on your African sister and brother, yeah, under this Operation Dudwala, because you have been brainwashed to believe that somehow the Ghanaian, the Nigerian, the Zimbabwean, the Botswanan, the Mozambican, the Angolan, the Guinean are taking your so-called job. No, not taking your so-called job. In actual fact, it was the Ghanaian, the Nigerian, the Gambian, the Zimbabwean, the Botswanian, the Namibian. All of these people gave money to the ANC and its military wing in Konto Sizwe, which means spear of the nation in Xhosa or Zulu. They gave money to support your battle or the ANC's battle against apartheid. Not many of you know that, do you? But again, I'll put proof of that in the footnotes to this podcast, that contrary to what you think you believe, African people in the content supported your struggle against apartheid. Yeah, not Cuba, but African people, your brothers and sisters that you're now beating on, they were the ones who actually, A, housed your leaders who were exiled, and B, supported the ANC and the country financially by giving them donations. Nigeria alone gave the ANC more than 50 million US dollars to support the campaign for liberation. Yeah? But you forget, but you conveniently forget that now, don't you? Yeah. So again, all these things happened after Steve Biko was uprising in South Africa. After the Soweto uprising and then death of Steve Biko, that kind of fast-tracked, the liberation struggle in South Africa. So again, the good story is taught. There was pressure because of Africans were putting pressure within the content and outside the content. And again, many of you so-called black South Africans and people listening to the podcast, you don't appreciate that African people living in London picketed outside South Africa House every day until Mandela was released. African people in France, in Rome, in Belgium, in Germany, in Spain, in Portugal, picketed outside South Africa High Commission in those countries. In America, African people in America, yeah, people like Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition, yeah, they were very, very, ardent speakers against the apartheid regime in South Africa that was suppressing the human dignity and the human rights and violation of human rights of African people in South Africa. They were very, very instrumental in that as well. And so all over the world, African people, right, rose up, wherever they were living, in Brazil, in US, in Canada, in Jamaica, in UK, in Germany, wherever you are, to protest against this vicious, brutal, barbaric apartheid regime. To the extent that even the West, who has supported the apartheid regime, both financially and also with arms, because let's not forget, white South Africa was a big, big arms manufacturer. And where did they get these arms from? Or how did they develop the technology to produce arms? It was their Western brothers and Israel. In actual fact, Israel helped South Africa produce a nuclear bomb. So before Mandela was released, South Africa had a nuclear bomb. Did you know that? Not a lot of you know that, do you? South Africa had a nuclear bomb that was produced by Israeli scientists. Yeah, they had a nuclear bomb. But I'll come on to that also later. Yeah, so African people around the world, you know, and within the content of Africa, we put pressure on the Western powers, right, to actually precipitate, the struggle by putting pressure on P.W. Botha and then F W De Klerk to actually release Mandela and subsequently call for elections. But before that, before Mandela was released, the pressure on South Africa was so great to an extent that there were even sports boycotts from sports like rugby, cricket, golf, etc. People wouldn't, have any, sporting in South Africa, and particularly most of the white population, sport was a big thing. Also, a lot of music stars would not, play in South Africa. A lot of movie stars would not go to South Africa. So South Africa was being shunned as a pariah state. Yeah. And even though the so-called sanctions that was imposed by the likes of the US, and also part of the European Union, that really didn't work because, countries like Britain, and at the time, the UK Prime Minister was Margaret Thatcher. Her husband, Dennis Thatcher, had business interests in South Africa. That's why Britain, did not really impose sanctions on South Africa. They were still doing business with South Africa behind the back door. So these sanctions really didn't work. It was actually the struggle on the ground, whereby African people demanding their freedom, right? And they were sabotaging, infrastructure in South Africa. That led to the precipitation of F W De Klerk, firstly, unbanning the groups like ANC, like the Pan-African Congress, like the South African Communist Party, and also he had no option but to release Nelson Mandela and other members of the ANC who were languishing in Robben Island. And three, at a later date, he knew that he had to call elections. But I'll get onto that later. But so the first thing, because of this pressure from African people around the world, particularly on the continent, and also more importantly, African people within South Africa, that pressurized the West into telling de Klerk that he had to release Nelson Mandela. And so in February 1990, after more than 26 and a bit years in prison, Nelson Mandela was released by the Apartheid authorities. Yeah? And many of you don't know this, right? But Nelson Mandela could have died in prison. But that would have caused a bigger bloodbath had Nelson Mandela died in prison, because he would have been a martyr for the African youth in South Africa. So it is alleged, and I need to tell you it is alleged, that Nelson Mandela was slow poisoned in prison to alter his faculties, so that when he came out, he would not be a threat to the white establishment, who could then see Nelson Mandela as someone that they could do business with. Yeah, so it is alleged that he was poisoned or slow poisoned. And so in 1990, Nelson Mandela was released. But my caveat on this is to you listeners to think about this, that no man spends more than 26 and a half years in prison, and then few years later, or less than 4 years later, wants to be president, unless there's a carefully scripted ploy or plan behind that. I want you to think, yeah? Because in less than 4 years, Nelson Mandela became president. Do you really believe, right, that there was no plan? It wasn't carefully orchestrated for Nelson Mandela to become president? I want you to think about that question. But let's go back to 1990 and when Nelson Mandela was released, and before that, how many of you know that as early as 1986, Nelson Mandela began secret talks, or rather de Klerk, began secret talks with the hierarchy, not even the hierarchy, with just Nelson Mandela. Because, like I said, it is alleged that Nelson Mandela was slow poisoned in order to damage his faculties, to make him more, less of a threat. Because the Nelson Mandela that went into prison and the Nelson Mandela that came out of prison were two different people. I'm going to say that again. The Nelson Mandela that went into prison in 1963 and the Nelson Mandela that was released from prison in 1990 were two different men. Think about that now. Just think about that. So it is alleged that Nelson Mandela, as far back as 1986, was having secret talks with de Klerk and others to secure his freedom and his agenda, so to speak, to put forward. But again, and it's something I'm going to reveal today, that how many of you know that South Africa, what is called South Africa today, is actually controlled by a secret brotherhood called the Afrikaner Brother Bond. Again, I'll put you the link in the footnotes, to a podcast. So when the National Party took power in 1948, after the British had relinquished it, because obviously it was, British South Africa, that's what it was called, under Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes became the first, or one of the first prime ministers of the Republic of South Africa. And South Africa was actually called the British South Africa Company. Again, under Cecil Rhodes, funded by Queen Victoria. Again, check out the history. So, South Africa, so to all intents and purposes, is a corporation, part of the British corporation, the British South Africa Corporation. And so Mandela's agenda was not really the agenda of the Freedom Charter, as I mentioned to you, that was the Bible of the ANC, i.e., give the land back, i.e., redistribution of wealth, i.e., the ownership of the minerals of the country to the masses of the people. That was not the agenda of Nelson Mandela, because the Nelson Mandela that came out was not the Nelson Mandela that came in. So Nelson Mandela that came out, he wanted basically glory for himself. And this is where the friction between himself and Winnie Mandela came in. Because Winnie Mandela, when Nelson Mandela was in prison, those dark days when Nelson Mandela was in prison, the great African woman, Winnie Mandela, she was the one who, kept the name of Nelson Mandela and the struggle alive. And she had a very hard time from when Nelson was put in prison, because she was a young woman when Nelson Mandela was put in prison. She was a young woman. So when Nelson Mandela came out, her life was under threat on so many occasions from the white authorities. And she had to look after her young children at the time. She had about 2 or 3 children before Nelson was put in prison. And she had to look after that young family on her own, as well as being the mother father or the motherhead for their struggle against apartheid. Yeah. And so going back to Nelson Mandela, he was doing underground deals with de Klerk, with the Afrikaner Brother Bond, right, to forward his agenda, which was not necessarily the agenda, as I mentioned, in the Freedom Charter. That Freedom Charter was the whole basis of the freedom struggle in South Africa. The land, the resources, and the wealth. So Nelson Mandela became, he was released in 1990, and he went about, touring the country, and also he came to Europe and America, and came to London, talked with Thatcher and etc., right? And because, like I said, it is alleged that he was poisoned so that his faculties were not as sharp as they were. Mandela became somebody who Thatcher, and more importantly, de Klerk, could do business with. And so during the so-called negotiations that led to the so-called democratic election in 1994, the ANC, right, wrote a charter, right? And that charter was nothing like the Freedom Charter that was the Bible that the ANC swore upon that they would follow when elected. And so this new so-called constitution and democracy, one of the architects of that current dispensation is the current president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa. He was one of the main architects of that South Africa Constitution and the Bill of Rights. But there were agitators, because people like Chris Hani of the South Africa Communist Party and also the Pan African Congress, they knew, they had an inclination that Mandela and then the higher members of the ANC were beginning to sell out, because they had not followed the instruction as set out in the Freedom Charter, but they were allowing themselves to be hoodwinked by the Afrikaner Brotherhood, by the Oppenheimer family, who, by the way, control all the diamonds in South Africa. Yeah. And they were also been hoodwinked by the neoliberalism of the Bretton Woods institutions that stated that the ANC should not nationalize the mines, should not redistribute wealth, and should not definitely touch the land. And so, Chris Hani became, a main, opposition in the front of the ANC. And also, what the white man did is also, so you had the opposition coming from Chris Hani and the South African Communist Party. You also had the white man, the European, play divide and rule, and factions within the ANC, and also factions of the Inkatha Freedom Party under King Buthelezi, because I don't know what a chief is. A chief is a derogatory term that European gave to our kinship, because when they came to Africa, they saw kings and queens, but because they thought they had their own kings and queens, they would want to relegate our kings and queens. And this is where the name chief came from, to dehumanize and to relegate our kings and queens. Yeah. So I don't buy the term chief. I buy the term king. So King Buthelezi or Zulu people, right? They were now fighting with remnants of Mandela's or the ANC. Yeah. And this is what created the friction between the Inkatha Freedom Party and also the ANC. And also, because Chris Hani knew that Mandela had sold out, even before the election of 1994, Mandela had sold out because he negated the tenets of the Freedom Charter he became a target for the white nationalists, i.e., those white people within the National Party, the Apartheid Party, who wanted to ensure that the land was still theirs, that the minerals were still theirs, and that the wealth of the country was predominantly in their hands. So this is why, factions came in, and to cut a long story short, Chris Hani, right, who many thought would be a future leader of South Africa, he was assassinated in 1993, I think by a white Polish guy. But again, I'll get that for you and put it in the notes. So Chris Hani, who was popular amongst the youth of South Africa, particularly Black South Africa, he was assassinated in 1993. And I can guess who orchestrated that assassination of Chris Hani. And so again, this left the way clear now for Nelson Mandela and the ANC, because the Pan-African Congress and also the South African Communist Party were no longer deemed, particularly after Chris Hani's assassination, to be a threat. And so this led the way for Mandela and others to actually, finalize the so-called negotiations with the De Klerk National Party. And also, on the other hand, you have this white supremacist group called themselves the Afrikaner, the AWB, under the leadership of Eugene Ter-Blanche. Again, I'll put his name and his details in the footnotes. So even they, because they feared so-called black power, i.e. the ANC coming to power. So they also tried to sabotage the negotiations in 1992, 1993. So they were also determined never to have a black party or an African party rule, as they called, as they saw it, their motherland. Think about it now. You come all the way from your descendants come all the way from Europe, right? You steal a country like your ancestors did in Australia and New Zealand and Canada, and now you want to call Africa your motherland. Just think of the arrogance of that. But anyway, the Eugene Ter-Blanche and his sub-neo-Nazi AWB, despite their sabotage, they could not derail the negotiations that led to the so-called democratic election of the ANC in 1994. So we come now to 1994, where ANC win a landslide and they become, the majority party in South Africa's parliament. And F W De Klerk now hands over the presidency to Nelson Mandela, who becomes the first democratically elected president of South Africa. And so, but before that, mind you, before that, I did tell you that South Africa, via Israel, had a nuclear bomb. On the eve of Mandela becoming president, they got rid of the nuclear bomb. I wonder why. I'll tell you why they got rid of the nuclear bomb. Because the Western powers could not countenance an African country being a nuclear power. Think about it now. Think about the power South Africa would have if South Africa was a nuclear power. Think about it now. When we see what's going on around the world and the geopolitical importance a nuclear power has. That's why the West can't do about Russia. And that's why they're to hoodwink Gaddafi to get rid of his nuclear weapons. That's why they're able to kill him. Had Gaddafi not been hoodwinked by Blair to get rid of nuclear weapons, right? Do you think they would have killed Gaddafi? I don't think so. And so, on the eve of Mandela being, or rather on the eve of the elections, white South Africa destroyed the nuclear weapons that they had. Yeah? So when the ANC came, South Africa had no nuclear arsenal. You don't think that was by design? Hmm? So when Nelson Mandela became president, right? Nelson Mandela did not follow the tenets of the Freedom Charter. Nelson Mandela, yeah, allowed himself, because, like I said, it is alleged that he was slow poisoned in prison so that his faculties would not be the same, so that he wouldn't be sharp, yeah, sharp-minded and alert, yeah. So Nelson Mandela, he did not talk about the land issue, because even today, 30 years after so-called apartheid ended, the majority of the land, 84%, is still in white hands. And white people, European people, Caucasian people make just 9%, 9% of the population. But yet that 9% owns 84% of the best land in South Africa. And the majority African population, by far the majority, about 75% of the population of South Africa is African, but yet that 75% owns just 5% of the land. Yeah? So this is the legacy of Nelson Mandela and the ANC by not touching the land. Again, the economy in South Africa is very, very skewed. Right? Prior to 1994, white people, European people held sway of the economy of South Africa. Today, despite your so-called black middle class, right, the majority of the economic activity is still in the hands of white people. These big companies in South Africa, like DSTV, like Castle Brewery, like MTN. MTN is the biggest telecommunications company in Africa that is owned by white South Africans. You may have some black people on the board, but the majority of the shareholders are European people. Yeah, you got big companies also, like the mining companies, like I said, Oppenheimer family, which is a white Jewish family. They control all the diamonds in South Africa and Southern Africa and the world. Yeah, the mining sector in South Africa is a vital sector. It's not just diamonds, but gold. Yeah, and also silver, and also some other precious metals that South Africa has. That is all in the hands of European people. Nelson Mandela didn't touch anything. And even the promises that Nelson Mandela made, yeah, on the eve of 1994 election, that they would build more than 2 million homes for African people, that they would create jobs for African people, that they would create a better standard of living for African people, that they would give African people a better standard of education, that they would give African people all these things that they promised. Nelson Mandela and the ANC, basically they failed all their promises. Today in South Africa, African people still live in squalor. Go to the so-called townships, right? Soweto, Alexandra, outside Cape Town, and other settlements, right? Where African people in the main live. Yeah, it's like a squatter camp. It's like a refugee camp. Yeah, there may be one or two nice houses, yeah, but the majority of those so-called settlements or townships, right, are in squalor. Yeah, education. Only those Africans who are well endowed financially can get their children a good education. The majority of African people in South Africa who are not financially well endowed, those children do not get a very good education. Healthcare in South Africa is very, very poor for the majority of African people in South Africa. Only the rich, those middle class Africans, only they can have good healthcare or can afford good healthcare. And this so-called Black Empowerment Initiative under Thabo Mbeki, who was Nelson Mandela's successor in 1999. That's something that he launched to try and, you know, buffer the gap. That didn't really work because a lot of that Black Empowerment initiative, that basically created a black middle class, but that black middle class still works for the white man. And like I said, the Afrikaner brother bond, the Afrikaner secret society, that is the linchpin of society in South Africa. They still run the country. They still call the shots. Yeah, the Afrikaner brother bond, they still call the shots. So the ANC under Mandela, they reneged big time on the Freedom Charter, and because they allowed themselves to go on a liberalization Bretton Woods type program, they were not able to fulfill the promises, right, that they made to African people in terms of schools, jobs, houses, etc. They failed. And so for me, right, Nelson Mandela is a traitor because he reneged on the Freedom Charter, and he also negotiated his own terms, his own conditions before his release in 1990. Yeah? And why do you think he was fettered by the West? If he was not a darling of the West, why do you think he was fettered? Hmm? Why do you think the West loved him so much? You know, Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, Bush. Why was he feted so much by them? If he did not do what they wanted to do, what they wanted him to do, i.e., keep the land in white hands, keep the resources in white hands, keep the minerals in white hands, keep the wealth in white hands. Hmm? So for me, Nelson Mandela was a traitor. The ANC themselves, and this is why Julius Malema left the ANC, right? So Malema used to be the youth president of the ANC, but because he saw the corruption, the greed, and the skullduggery and the traitorism within Mandela and over senior members of the ANC, which is why Julius Malema left to form his own party, because he understood that the ANC had negated the Freedom Charter, which was the linchpin of what the whole Freedom Charter was. So Thabo Mbeki, Jacob Zuma, and now, Cyril Ramaphosa, all of them have followed the same template. Don't touch the land, don't redistribute wealth, do not nationalize the mines. Yeah, all of them have followed that hymn sheet that was started by Nelson Mandela. And for me, we can never forgive Nelson Mandela because he had the opportunity. When he came out in 1990, he had the opportunity to revolutionize South Africa. The same revolution that's going on in Senegal, in Mali, in Burkina, in Niger. Nelson Mandela could have done that 30 years ago. But he chose the easy option. Or rather, as I mentioned, because his faculties were not the same, because of the alleged poison, he allowed himself to be hoodwinked by those like the Afrikaner Brother Bond and others who wanted to keep South Africa a white country, in the sense of a white country economically, minerally, and the wealth. Yeah, Nelson Mandela was played upon. And for me, we can't forgive that, because today, South Africa is one of the most one of the most unequal societies in the world. Let me give you a prime example of this. Johannesburg, right? Johannesburg, parts of Johannesburg is like New York, is like Rome, is like Paris, is like London. There's a part of Johannesburg called Stanton. Yeah, Stanton. Randburg, Krugersdorp. These are plush areas. These beats anything in Champs-Élysées in Paris, beats anything in London, Knightsbridge, beats anything in New York, Rhode Island. Stanton, right? Krugersdorp, Randburg. That is the richest real estate in Africa. And just down the road, not even 4 miles across the road, is Soweto, a township that was created in the apartheid era, where African people are overpopulated in a small parcel of land. Hmm? And you want to call that fair? You think South Africa is free? And even one white journalist that I respect a lot, the late great John Pilger, he did a documentary long time ago. This is even when Mandela was alive. He did a documentary, Why Apartheid Did Not Die. And again, I'll put you that documentary in the footnote so you can see that for yourself. And you can understand why South Africa is still an apartheid state. Because in that documentary that John Pilger did, he even talked to Mandela and even made him aware of the situation that he was allowing the country to face before he stepped down in 1999. But Nelson Mandela couldn't see because, like I said, his faculties may have been tampered with. Yeah? So that shows that South Africa is an unequal society. Yeah? And to add salt to injury, there is a white-only town in South Africa today. Today, in 2024, there is a white-only town in South Africa called Orange. How has the ANC allowed a white-only town in South Africa? Do you think you can have a black-only town in London? You think you can have a black-only town in Paris or France? You think you can have a black-only town in Canada? You think you can have a black-only town in Italy? You think you can have a black-only town in Germany? You think you can have a black-only town in Belgium? I don't think so. So why has the ANC allowed itself for white people who want apartheid to come back legally for them to have their own town called Orange? Again, I'll put you that town in the notes to this podcast, and you can see it for yourself. That is an injury to all those African people who fought and died for free South Africa. Yeah? So, in closing, Nelson Mandela and the ANC were traitors to Africans in South Africa because they didn't talk about the land, they didn't talk about the redistribution of wealth, and they didn't talk about the nationalization of the mines, particularly diamonds. 2, apartheid is still in South Africa today. It's not the legal apartheid that was there between 1948 and 1994. It's a new form of apartheid. It's an economic apartheid. Yeah? But it's even more dangerous than the apartheid on the legal segregation, where African people on the whole do not have land, or I'll come to that in a minute, where African people are not allowed to enjoy in the wealth of the country. That is economic apartheid. 3, African people are landless. This is the legacy of Nelson Mandela and ANC. The African people to this day do not have their land back, where 84% of the best land is still in white hands. That for me is a treacherous legacy that Mandela and the ANC have left. South Africa today is more unequal today than it was in 1994. And that is a legacy of the economic paradigm that Mandela and the ANC have adopted that has made South Africa the most unequal country in Africa and one of the most unequal countries in the world. And lastly, how can African people have freedom when white people have their own state within a state in the country? Like I said, in Orange. And now we're here. There's also a white faction called Swedelanders, Sweidlanders, Swedelanders, who want to create an armed revolution to make South Africa a white country again and to get rid of the ANC government. Yeah? So this tells you that despite all the so-called Rainbow Nation or all the rubbish that comes out of the Western media, South Africa is still an apartheid state 30 years after Nelson Mandela became the first democratically elected president of South Africa, and what have you. And the ANC has let South Africa down. And there's elections next month in South Africa, and we hear that the ANC could lose the majority for the first time, because every election since 1994, the ANC has had a great majority, but now there is talk that South Africa, could be under a coalition government. And for me, that may be a good thing, because the ANC has failed African people in South Africa, because it has allowed itself to be hoodwinked by the Afrikaner Brotherhood and white nationalist corporate interests at the expense of true African emancipation and also economic freedom. And so I thank you for listening to this special edition of Africa in Focus with myself, Kwame, Ghanaian journalist, broadcaster, writer, podcaster, and entrepreneur. If you like the show, please send it to your friends, your family, social media networks. Subscribe to the Africa Ghana in Focus podcast on YouTube and also on Spotify. Okay, so until next time, thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you in the next edition of Africa in Focus.